The bomber roared down the rain-slick runway, engines vibrating with the tension of expectation, the fuselage shuddering beneath the weight of metal, crew, and ordnance. The rookie pilot, still conscious of the strictures of training, yet acutely aware of the unknown, gripped the yoke with measured fingers, knuckles pale beneath worn leather gloves. His headset muffled the drone of the engines, yet every micro-vibration, every subtle resonance in the metal skin of the plane traveled straight into his chest, a constant reminder that the aircraft was alive, and that survival required total focus. The navigator, seated beside him, traced finger across the folded chart, checking headings against the horizon through frost-specked glass, while the bombardier leaned forward in the nose, peering through the glass with a careful, practiced eye. Even in these first moments of ascent, the crew had fallen into their rhythm, quiet coordination born of training and necessity, each micro-movement precise, each glance an unspoken confirmation of procedure. Outside, the sky was layered with cloud formations, sun struggling to cut through in thin, scattered beams that glinted off the bomber's metallic surfaces. The thin haze and rising vapors from the runway blurred distant tree leans, transforming familiar landscapes into a shifting tapestry that required constant mental correction. Engines were throttled forward, propellers slicing the morning mist, producing a rhythmic, almost hypnotic vibration that pulsed through both the airframe and the crew's concentration. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of canopy frames, streaked by condensation and minor scratches, turning every glance through the glass into a muted visual puzzle. The pilot's eyes swept across the horizon, comparing visual cues against compass readings and altimeter data, the process a delicate balance between instinct and calculation. Even minor deviations in airspeed or altitude could cascade into danger when flak and enemy interceptors awaited beyond the cloud layers. Every instrument, every gauge, was a subtle argument between human skill and mechanical reality, and the rookie felt each oscillation as a lesson in humility. The bomber climbed through layers of stratocumulus, sunlight striking scattered rivets and warp panels, revealing dents and scratches from past sorties. The sound of air rushing over the fuselage was deafening in the pilot's ears, a constant, mechanical roar that competed with the internal rhythm of his own heartbeat. Despite the adrenaline, his breath remained measured, each exhale deliberate, a small act of control against the unpredictable environment surrounding him. He adjusted the throttle slightly, feeling the lag of the engines, noting subtle oscillations in pitch that the flight engineer beside him interpreted as minor inconsistencies in cylinder pressure. The engineer's hands moved over dials and levers with practiced ease, soft clicks punctuating the ambient drone, monitoring, adjusting, and correcting. The bomber's weight shifted slightly with each engine response, wings flexing imperceptibly, every rivet and bolt absorbing strain in quiet testimony to both craftsmanship and overuse. The navigator checked headings again, lips moving in micro-calculations, eyes darting to the horizon as he compensated for wind shear and thermal currents rising from sunlit land below. He worked with the calm intensity of someone balancing exacting mathematics against unpredictable nature. Below, farmland and industrial zones stretched like patchwork, scarred with bomb craters and smoke plumes rising from previous raids. The sight struck a balance between operational objective and human cost, a duality the rookie pilot absorbed silently, awareness settling in layers over instinctive reactions. The bombardier's hands adjusted the sight, eyes narrowing against glare and frost, as instruments in the nose flickered with minor inconsistencies, the internal environment of the aircraft nearly as hazardous as the sky outside. The crew had long learned that concentration was survival, that mechanical systems, environmental factors, and enemy action all demanded continuous vigilance. The first hints of flak appeared as subtle puffs of smoke on the horizon, distant yet impossible to ignore. Even this early, the pilot understood that timing, formation, and mutual support would define the difference between a manageable risk and catastrophic loss. His glances flicked to the lead aircraft, noting spacing and relative altitude, while maintaining mental accounting for throttle adjustments, wind, and the minor mechanical quirks of his own plane. Each micro-correction was a negotiation with physics and circumstance. Within the fuselage, air temperature fluctuated, condensation forming and evaporating across cold metal surfaces, instruments flickering under inconsistent power, adding another layer of sensory complexity. The crew adjusted instinctively, their movements choreographed by repetition, yet always conscious of the uniqueness of the moment. The rookie, newly in command of these forces, internalized the rhythm and fragility of survival. The wings shimmer with frost and condensation streaks, paint dulled by repeated exposure to sun, wind, and rain. Rivets glinted faintly in the shifting light, reminders of both human labor and the inherent vulnerability of metal pressed into service against gravity, weather, and enemy fire. Every turn, climb, and throttle change produced subtle feedback through yoke, pedals, and seat, integrating human muscle with machine response. The bomber leveled briefly at higher altitude, engines producing a steady, vibrating hum, and the pilot allowed himself a quiet moment to observe formation geometry, the spacing of nearby aircraft, and the faint outline of enemy search zones far ahead. He noted how minor deviations in lead could propagate into hazard, how the overlapping fields of defensive fire depended entirely on discipline and alignment. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, a tangible presence in the cabin. Even as he focused on instruments, visual references, and crew, the emotional layer, the awareness of risk, the lives depending on small decisions, and the fragile balance of control was inescapable. Clouds thickened slightly, soft light muted by dense overcast, casting long shadows over the fuselage. The bomber pitched gently with thermal updrafts, a subtle reminder that flight was negotiation with forces far larger than human intention. The rookie's mind alternated between conscious monitoring and instinctive response, a layering of learned procedure, adaptive skill, and raw perception. The engines hummed, the air hissed past the fuselage, and the distant horizon remained an evolving canvas of threat and opportunity. The formation adjusted collectively, minor shifts translating through the air like pulses, yet each plane remained an individual struggle against mechanical, environmental, and operational pressures. The pilot's glances, repeated and precise, marked the interface between human decision and environmental complexity. Below, smoke rose from farmlands and industrial centers scarred by prior raids, a muted, tangible reminder of both mission success and destruction. Instruments flickered as minor turbulence and engine variance challenged their precision, yet crew coordination kept systems and situational awareness aligned. Through controlled breathing, careful throttle adjustments, and measured communication, the rookie pilot navigated this layered, dynamic environment. Each mile flown reinforced both confidence and vulnerability, a combination that would define every decision for the remainder of the sortie. The engine's rhythm, the subtle shifts of metal, the cold air of altitude, and the layered clouds all fused into a continuous, immersive tableau. The first mission into enemy skies, fragile, tense, and alive with the weight of expectation and the quiet tension of survival. The sky above the continent had thickened into a mottled ceiling of gray, clouds drifting in uneven layers, each undulating current a potential threat, and each sunbeam a fleeting, cold reminder of altitude and exposure. The bomber formation pressed forward, engines droning with a mechanical insistence that seemed to echo the collective heartbeat of the crews within. The rookie pilot, still acclimating to the relentless hum and vibration of the aircraft, noticed subtle shudders in the wings that were absent on the last flight, micro indications of strain that whispered of the forces compressing the metal around him. The navigator, eyes darting between chart and horizon, marked every minor course adjustment, compensating for crosswinds and unseen air currents, while the bombardier in the nose peered through frost-streaked glass, adjusting his sight for the shifting angle of the sun and cloud shadows, the condensation along the window a constant, tangible barrier between observation and the open sky. The first flak appeared as distant puffs of smoke, irregular, faint, and almost unremarkable until one detonated closer, sending a jolt through the bomber's frame. Metal vibrated in response, rivets humming under tension, and the pilot's hands tightened instinctively on the yoke. The crew did not panic. The vibration and smell of gunpowder were familiar enough to draw routine checks and procedural adjustments, yet each concussion left a trace on the air and the mind, subtle but accumulating, a reminder that operational reality had become unpredictable. The flight engineer leaned toward his panel, checking manifold pressure and cylinder temperatures, fingers gliding over switches and gauges, interpreting readings that would determine whether a minor tremor would cascade into a catastrophic failure. Each gauge needle trembled slightly, a visual echo of the aircraft's stress, and the pilot adjusted altitude and speed, communicating silently through nods and microgestures learned over previous sorties. Enemy fighters appeared next, small dark shapes against the cloud layers, distant but moving with unmistakable intent. Their silhouettes cut sharply against muted sunbeams, wings angled for speed and surprise, a reminder that the controlled environment of training had given way to the improvisational calculus of combat. Gunners shifted into position, gloved hands tightening around cold steel, eyes scanning, muscles coiled with a tension that vibrated through the fuselage. The tail gunner's turret rotated with a low, metallic whine, plexiglass fogged by temperature differential and frost, revealing the weathered metal of the gun's mounting and the subtle scratches that mapped every previous sortie. From the cockpit, the pilot could feel the collective strain of these encounters, a rhythm of anticipation and reaction that required constant vigilance. Each command and adjustment, a negotiation with the environment, the aircraft, and the unseen adversary beyond the clouds. Minor damage began to accumulate in ways that were immediately noticeable only through careful observation. Small rivets loosened under stress. Paint chipped from flak splinters, and one engine emitted a faint, intermittent cough that suggested overheating or momentary misfire. The crew responded with procedural precision. Throttles adjusted, altitude shifted slightly, control inputs refined, and instruments monitored with heightened attention. Yet each minor correction was layered with the psychological awareness that the sum of these small faults could not be entirely contained, that survival now required judgment and improvisation as much as training. The navigator noted subtle differences in heading drift, accounting for gusts and enemy-induced maneuvers, while the pilot balanced these corrections against engine strain and formation integrity. Every adjustment echoed in the metal. Every decision passed to the crew as a quiet, tense rhythm that tethered them to operational reality. Within the fuselage, sensory overload began to register more acutely. The cold of altitude seeped through the worn flight jackets. Instruments hummed and flickered with electrical inconsistency, and the vibration of the engines resonated through the floor and seats. Frost formed along panel edges and canopy seams. Condensation streaked the interior, and the smell of heated oil and metal mingled with the tang of oxygen and the faint smoke lingering from distant flak bursts. Each crew member maintained focus, yet the cumulative effect of environmental, mechanical, and operational stress pressed on cognitive and emotional reserves. Hands trembled slightly when adjusting levers, eyes flicked with renewed vigilance across instruments and skies, and minor gestures, tilting ahead, leaning slightly, adjusting a glove, became essential tools in maintaining control. The formation itself was under strain. Aircraft that had flown tightly together for miles began to show slight deviation in altitude and heading, a natural consequence of turbulence and stress compounded by minor mechanical irregularities. Pilots adjusted instinctively, wings flexing against the air, engines responding to throttle modulation, while gunners maintained visual sweeps for threats, scanning a moving, three-dimensional chessboard of metal, sky, and unseen projectiles. Each aircraft's motion affected others, a delicate interplay between physical forces and human reaction. The young pilot noted these subtle interdependencies, the way a slight misalignment could ripple through formation, and how coordinated response remained a critical margin between order and chaos. Enemy flak continued to pepper the air, larger bursts now punctuating the sky with black smoke and ringing concussions, sending tremors along the fuselage and rattling loose panels and equipment. The crew felt the aircraft shudder under each impact, the subtle twist in metal and flexing of wings perceptible even from inside the cockpit. The engineer's adjustments became more frequent, subtle changes in throttle, and mixture aimed at preventing a mechanical cascade that could compromise the bomber. The bombardier continued to monitor ground targets, eyes narrowing through misty glass, while the navigator recalculated headings to maintain the approach path despite evasive maneuvers and wind drift. Even as the aircraft endured physical assault, the psychological tension intensified in measured increments. The young pilot's mind alternated between conscious calculation, altitude, heading, engine load, flak density, and a more instinctive perception of the aircraft condition, the crew's readiness, and the surrounding formation. The interplay between training and intuition became essential, a mental choreography that required constant adjustment. He noted the faint changes in engine sound, the subtle flex of the fuselage under gusts, and the nearly imperceptible deviation of instruments, weaving these into a continuous assessment that would guide both immediate survival and adherence to mission objectives. By the time the formation cleared the initial belt of flak, minor damages had been logged, procedural adjustments maintained operational stability, and the crews had integrated the tactile, visual, and auditory feedback of their aircraft under fire. The bomber continued forward, engines vibrating with a rhythmic insistence, wings flexing under stress. Crew focused yet quietly aware of the cumulative toll of the sortie. The sky above and below remained a layered tableau of threat and navigation. Each cloud, sunbeam, and distant smoke plume a point of reference in an environment defined as much by its danger as by the discipline required to traverse it. The chapter closed on a note of operational awareness solidified by tension, the formation pressing onward, aircraft systems responding to careful management, and the crew's emotional state tempered by a mixture of anxiety, focus, and quiet resolve. The first fires of resistance had been felt, minor damages had accumulated, and the reality of sustained operations under hostile conditions was now imprinted on both machine and human. The pilot's awareness had expanded from technical execution to an embodied understanding of fragility, endurance, and the measured risks of war in the sky. The bomber moved steadily through a sky that had grown dense with gray, cloud layers thickening as it depressed down on the aircraft itself. The sun struggled to break through the overcast, casting muted, directional light across frost-lined panels and glinting rivets, highlighting every dent and scratch that testified to both past sorties and current strain. Within the cockpit, the pilot's hands rested lightly but firmly on the yoke, muscles coiled, eyes scanning instruments and horizon in rhythm with the aircraft's vibration. The engines thrummed with a deep, resonant hum, each note a constant reminder of the precarious balance between power and fragility, between human skill and mechanical reality. Slight shudders traveled along the fuselage, subtle but insistent, a whisper of the stress accumulating from the weight of ordnance, fuel, and altitude. The pilot's jaw tensed, not from fear, but from the awareness that every micro-adjustment carried consequences, that the difference between control and chaos was often measured in inches and fractions of seconds. The navigator, seated just behind and slightly to the side, traced coordinates across the folded charts, eyes flicking between lines of ink and the shifting horizon outside. Frost streaked the canopy glass in narrow, irregular lines, blurring distant shapes and forcing him to interpret every subtle shadow, every muted contour, as a potential landmark, a navigational fix, or threat. His lips moved silently, recalculating wind drift and heading corrections with a rhythm honed by hours of repeated sorties. Yet even routine calculations carried a heightened tension, a sense that minor errors could cascade under the pressures of isolation and environmental unpredictability. The bombardier, in the nose, leaned forward against the cold plexiglass, instrument in hand, eyes narrowing through condensation and frost. Even at this early stage, he noted the faint tremors that suggested minor structural stress, subtle warping of panels under temperature differential and aerodynamic pressure. He did not speak, for there was no need. His observations passed silently to the pilot through small gestures and glances, a choreography developed through shared focus and necessity. As the bomber drifted from its original position in the formation, the first sensations of isolation took shape. Neighboring aircraft were faint shapes in the haze, their relative positions only perceptible through careful observation and mental reconstruction. The slight variations in altitude and heading, imperceptible over short distances, amplified the sense of exposure, as the aircraft now had fewer protective layers of overlapping defensive fire and mutual coverage. The tail gunner adjusted his turret slowly, testing rotation and range, gloves stiff from altitude and frost. Eyes scanned the sky with disciplined vigilance, micro-expressions of tension and awareness etched into features, a quiet testament to the mental strain imposed by isolation. Even minor flak bursts, faint puffs of smoke in the distance, seemed magnified, each one forcing adjustments in altitude and angle, subtle shifts in control that reverberated throughout the fuselage. Within the aircraft, the cumulative effects of sensory overload were palpable. The engines thrummed constantly, a low, vibrating presence that pressed into bones and muscles. Frost and condensation formed intricate patterns along canopy edges and panel seams, reflecting muted light and intermittently obscuring the crew's view. The smell of warm metal, faint oil, and residual smoke mingled in the cabin air, carried along with a subtle chill of altitude, forming an invisible texture that the crew absorbed unconsciously. Hands move repeatedly over controls and instruments, gloved fingers brushing against familiar surfaces, feeling every vibration, every temperature shift, every resistance in levers and switches. Even routine adjustments demanded heightened attention, a focus that taxed both mind and body in equal measure. The formation around them had begun to spread, small deviations compounding into a perceptible drift. Other aircraft were visible but distant. Silhouettes ghosted through layers of mist and cloud, each one a separate vessel with its own vulnerabilities, its own strain, its own unspoken calculation of risk. The pilot noted each relative position, adjusting subtly, calculating throttle, rudder, and aileron input with every correction, aware that even minor misalignments could propagate instability through the formation. Gunners on other aircraft could no longer provide overlapping defensive coverage with the same immediacy, leaving each individual bomber more exposed and demanding precise, instinctive decision-making. Communication channels became intermittent. Static hissed through the radio. Voice transmission faltered in a rhythm that required patience and repeated confirmation. Each attempt to coordinate headings, threat locations, or mechanical anomalies added cognitive load, demanding attention while the pilot maintained control. The navigator adjusted heading, and the bombardier continued to track objectives. The cockpit was a theater of simultaneous demands: mechanical management, navigational precision, observational vigilance, and emotional regulation. Each crew member absorbed multiple layers of information, integrating sight, sound, and tactile feedback into actionable decisions. Fatigue, both physical and mental, began to manifest in micro delays, slight hesitations, the imperceptible tightening of shoulders and jaws. Mechanical stress compounded these operational pressures. One engine fluctuated slightly in manifold pressure, a minor irregularity that could escalate if uncorrected. The flight engineer's gloved hand hovered over levers and gauges, adjusting with delicate precision, interpreting every vibration and sound as a diagnostic signal. The aircraft flexed subtly under aerodynamic load, wings twisting imperceptibly, fuselage panels vibrating under accumulated fatigue. Each adjustment passed through the pilot's awareness, integrated into control input, flight path, and coordination with the drifting formation. Outside, the clouds churned in slow, layered motion, shadows shifting across the bomber's surface, highlighting dented panels, frost line seams, and small punctures from previous sorties. Even as the crew managed mechanical and operational complexity, the psychological weight of isolation pressed steadily. Every visual cue, every vibration, every sound became more than data. It was a measure of risk, a prompt for decision, a reminder of vulnerability. Each minor deviation in instruments or aircraft behavior was interpreted not only for immediate consequence, but also for its potential to cascade under enemy threat, atmospheric turbulence, or compounded fatigue. The pilot's eyes, constantly alternating between instrument panel and horizon, reflected the duality of perception and judgment, the need to act decisively in the present while anticipating the unpredictable consequences of continued strain. By the midpoint of the sortie, minor alarms, flickering instrument lights, and subtle shudders had established a persistent tension. The bomber continued forward, engines vibrating, wings flexing, each crew member performing tasks with meticulous care and silent awareness of the stakes. Micro adjustments became the rhythm of survival, each decision layered with physical, emotional, and operational consequence. Frost and condensation accentuated the visual field, while ambient sounds, the hum of engines, clicks of controls, hiss of airflow, provided continuous feedback on the aircraft's condition. The cumulative effect was a dense, immersive environment of sensory and operational complexity. Isolation magnified small threats into significant challenges, while fatigue and psychological strain layered over environmental and mechanical stress. The aircraft and crew moved as a single organism, each microaction integrated into a larger pattern of endurance and survival, navigating the delicate balance between mission objectives, human capacity, and mechanical limitations. By the chapter's conclusion, the bomber had endured both physical and operational strain. The crew adapted to the compounding isolation, and the pilot awareness had evolved from technical management to embodied understanding of cumulative risk, fatigue, and the subtle choreography required to maintain survival under the compounded pressures of enemy engagement, environmental uncertainty, and mechanical fragility. The tail gunner's turret rattled as the bomber shuddered under a sudden near-miss flak burst, the air around the fuselage vibrating with concussive energy. Inside the cramped station, Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the plexiglass, streaked by condensation and faint scratches, each mark a record of previous missions, each microabrasion catching the muted sunlight in odd glints. The gunner's gloved hands tightened on controls, knuckles whitening, every finger attuned to the subtle resistance of the levers and triggers. His breath fogged the interior briefly before dispersing, mixing with the lingering scent of warm metal, oil, and the faint tang of gunpowder from distant bursts. A slight tremor traveled along the turret's base as the fuselage flexed, reminding him that the aircraft itself was alive, responding to the forces imposed by altitude, wind, and enemy fire. He shifted slightly, testing the rotation of the twin-mounted machine guns, eyes narrowing to align with the distant traces of enemy fighters approaching from cloud cover. Each aircraft in the formation moved as a single, fragile organism. Yet in moments like this, isolation became tangible, the protective layers of overlapping firepower diminished by damage and drift. The gunner's mind ran a rapid calculus, weighing angle of attack, trajectory, wind drift, and the structural limitations of his own plane. Training offered a set of procedures, a structured response to known threats. Yet the irregularities accumulating from minor flak damage and engine stress had begun to blur the boundaries between textbook maneuver and improvisation. He felt the familiar friction of fear tempered by focus, a tension held not in panic, but in the disciplined contraction of muscle, eye, and thought. The fuselage shivered again as a flak shell exploded near the starboard wing, rattling instruments in the cockpit forward, sending a low, resonant hum through the floor. The pilot's glances flicked to the rear-view mirrors and out the side windows, noting the trajectory of bursts, the spacing of other bombers, and the drift that had begun to separate them from formation integrity. The navigator leaned forward, lips moving in silent recalculation, tracing course corrections while eyes continuously scanned both cloud and ground. Communication between stations had become sparse, static-laden, each brief exchange requiring immediate comprehension and precise execution. In that quiet rhythm of coordinated action, the gunner's own decision-making grew heavier. The standard protocol no longer guaranteed survival, either for the aircraft or the mission. He observed a lone fighter breaking through cloud layers, approaching at an angle that would evade the conventional firing arcs of his turret. The enemy pilot was skilled, calculating, exploiting gaps in formation coverage and the mechanical limitations imposed by frost and minor damage. The gunner's instinct surged ahead of training, a convergence of months of repetition and split-second judgment. He considered options, adhere strictly to procedure, which might allow the fighter to close without resistance, or attempt an unconventional adjustment, twisting the turret beyond normal limits, risking both personal safety and the integrity of the aircraft. Each choice carried tangible consequences, the weight of responsibility pressing against a rhythm of breathing and heartbeat, each tremor of the aircraft echoing the stakes of action versus inaction. His hands moved with deliberate precision, overriding minor mechanical limits with subtle leverage, eyes fixed on the target, calculating lead and trajectory, accounting for wind, shear, and altitude. Every adjustment produced feedback through vibration and resistance. Every micro-movement a dialogue between human intention and machine reality. The plexiglass reflected faint tracers, shadows of wing edges, and the glint of enemy fuselage. Each cue integrated into his awareness in fractions of a second. The gunner felt the surge of control and risk as one. The metal beneath him flexing, the aircraft tilting slightly, the engines vibrating in protest and partnership, each element interacting as a single system constrained by physics and circumstance. Sweat dampened his gloves despite the altitude chill, and the interior fogged briefly as he exhaled sharply, eyes unblinking as he anticipated the fighter's evasive maneuvers. Behind him, the tail section hummed under stress, rivets subtly vibrating, a muted chorus of tension reinforcing the immediacy of decision. The pilot adjusted course slightly, unaware of the precise choice the gunner was contemplating. Yet the aircraft responded as if acknowledging convergence of multiple wills. The collective intent of crew and machine now intertwined in a singular, dangerous calculus. Every microsecond mattered. Every hesitation could allow a fatal closure distance. The gunner's fingers tightened, the levers resisting as if testing resolve. He adjusted the angle, levering the turret slightly beyond standard arc, a maneuver frowned upon in training, but necessary here. The slight shift brought the enemy into range, aligning guns with target, while creating additional strain on mounting points in glass. He anticipated both the recoil and the feedback of the fuselage, modulating pressure and posture to maintain stability. The distant formation drifted slightly. Other bombers silhouetted through haze, a visual reminder that their collective support was now attenuated. His awareness expanded outward. Enemy aircraft, formation integrity, structural stress, and the internal mechanics of his own reflexes merged into a continuous, high-stakes calculation. As the first rounds were fired, the recoil rattled through the turret, metallic vibrations reverberating in his shoulders and arms, the plexiglass transmitting subtle oscillations that demanded micro-corrections. Tracers arced through the misty sky, intersecting with the silhouette of the enemy fighter, the pilot's earlier adjustments contributing indirectly to the firing angle, the navigator's course recalibration helping to stabilize the platform. The machine guns bit into the air with mechanical certainty, each shot a small, precise interaction between human intent, physics, and opportunity. A close burst of enemy tracer fire illuminated frost streaks on the turret, highlighting scratches and worn metal, as though the aircraft itself were bearing witness to the choice being enacted. Even in this moment of acute action, the gunner felt the weight of consequence. Training had outlined procedure, but procedure could not account for every nuance of structural strain, mechanical deviation, or enemy cunning. Instinct and experience guided his hands, eyes, and mind through a delicate improvisation, each decision layered with both operational significance and personal risk. He noted the slight flex of the fuselage, the oscillation of the wings, the shiver of rivets under stress, integrating each sensory cue into the ongoing calculation. His body moved in synchrony with the machine, a partnership between human intuition and mechanical response, an exercise in endurance, precision, and moral responsibility. The enemy aircraft responded, banking sharply, tracers cutting arcs across muted cloud layers. The gunner adjusted quickly, anticipating trajectory and compensation, leveraging every ounce of training and instinct. The bomber flexed beneath him, engines humming in careful modulation, the pilot subtly correcting course, the navigator recalculating drift, all converging to create a moment of controlled chaos in which one individual's choice could define the fate of many. Sweat, frost, vibration, wind, and adrenaline coalesced into a concentrated awareness, a state in which hesitation was costly and precision demanded. In those sustained seconds, the gunner acknowledged the consequences: mechanical strain, personal exposure, potential loss, but also the possibility of altering the immediate trajectory of the aircraft and mission. Each round fired, each micro-adjustment of angle and pressure, was an assertion of agency against the imposed chaos, a deliberate negotiation with circumstance. The aircraft trembled, shuddered, and flexed, but responded, carrying both crew and machinery through the confluence of risk, skill, and necessity. By the time the fighter broke away, the turret rested once more in controlled alignment. The immediate danger passed, but the weight of the choice remained palpable. The gunner's body relaxed only slightly, awareness still finely tuned to subtle vibration and movement, recognizing the thin margin by which training, instinct, and courage had intersected preserve life and mission. The bomber floated in the muted gray of late afternoon clouds, engines vibrating with the residual tension of combat, the fuselage flexing subtly under accumulated stress. Outside, the horizon was a flat, indistinct sweep of pale light and shifting shadow, the land below obscured by smoke rising from bombed industrial zones and distant fires. The crew moved within the cabin with careful deliberation, each action precise, almost ritualized, honed by hours of experience and tempered by the sharp edge of recent danger. The tail gunner adjusted his turret, hands lingering over the cold steel, fingers tracing familiar contours as he scanned the distant sky, eyes narrowing against glare and mist. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of glass panels. Condensation streaked in irregular lines, glinting in muted sunlight, a fragile lens through which the crew both observed and interpreted their environment. Each rivet, scratch, and dent in the airframe was a tangible record of the mission's intensity, a map of stress points and near misses that spoke to both the skill and endurance of the men within. The pilot's hands rested lightly on the yoke, muscles coiled in residual tension, even as the immediate danger receded. Each micro-movement of throttle or rudder was measured, accounting for subtle shifts in air pressure and the slight yaw of the fuselage under mechanical strain. His eyes swept across the horizon, noting the positions of distant bombers in the formation, the faint plumes of flak still drifting upward in the haze, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in cloud cover that could conceal or reveal both risk and opportunity. The navigator crouched over charts, recalculated headings in quiet isolation, fingers tracing lines over ink coordinates, adjusting for drift, wind, and course corrections that had accumulated during evasive maneuvers. Even as the bomber leveled, the crew remained acutely aware that survival was not a static achievement, but a continuous process of observation, adaptation, and disciplined response. The bombardier's gaze swept the landscape below, eyes narrowing against condensation and glare, noting the faint outlines of bomb craters, damaged factories, and disrupted rail lines. Each target reflected the duality of the mission, strategic necessity and human cost, and the young officer absorbed these images with quiet, internalized weight. His hands, resting momentarily on the sighting instruments, traced the contours of previous adjustments, a tactile memory of calculation and precision. Outside, smoke mingled with cloud layers, forming a semi-opaque veil that altered perception, challenged navigation, and lent a surreal texture to the aerial environment. Even minor shifts in light, wind, or visibility carried operational significance, and the crew interpreted these cues continuously, balancing immediate safety with broader mission parameters. Mechanical feedback remained constant. The engines hummed with resonant, low-pitched vibration, carrying through floors, seats, and control surfaces, a persistent reminder of power harnessed and stress endured. The fuselage flexed with minor, almost imperceptible undulations, wings twisting subtly under aerodynamic load, rudder and ailerons responding to fine adjustments. The flight engineer's hands moved along panels with deliberate care, monitoring manifold pressures, cylinder temperatures, and fuel flow, each microfluctuation logged and assessed. Minor anomalies, a subtle call from an engine, a brief flicker of an instrument needle, the vibration of a slightly loosened rivet, demanded attention, yet the crew had learned to integrate these irregularities into continuous operational rhythm. Even as the immediate threat of enemy fire diminished, the physical dialogue between human and machine remained demanding, a constant negotiation of attention, strength, and anticipation. Fatigue pressed heavily. Hours of heightened vigilance, sustained posture, and continuous micro-adjustments had eroded physical and cognitive reserves. Hands trembled slightly, eyes flicked with sharper focus and micro-delays, and the subtle tension in shoulders and jaw betrayed both exhaustion and a lingering imprint of adrenaline. Crew members moved quietly. Gestures minimized to conserve energy, each shift, adjustment, and observation executed with careful deliberation. The weight of the mission's earlier intensity persisted not just as memory, but as a tangible presence in posture, breath, and muscle tone. Every minor sound, air rushing past fuselage, faint metallic creaks, intermittent engine fluctuations, was amplified in perception, both a signal of ongoing operational demands and a reminder of the human cost of sustained aerial engagement. Communication was muted now, intermittent radio static punctuated by brief, clipped exchanges confirming headings, positions, and mechanical status. The navigator transmitted course adjustments with minimal inflection, voice tight with focus, while the pilot acknowledged with short, deliberate phrases, each syllable carrying precision and efficiency. The bombardier relayed observations of terrain and residual flak locations, ensuring situational awareness remained intact. In these moments, the human network of coordination functioned as both procedural necessity and psychological anchor, a structure through which collective endurance maintained a fragile equilibrium of the aircraft and crew. External cues reinforced operational awareness, even in relative calm. The drifting smoke of prior engagements, the muted glint of rivets and panel seams reflecting pale sunlight, and the occasional distant glimmer of other bombers formed a layered, dynamic environment. Each element required interpretation, a continuous process of mental modeling integrating physics, tactical doctrine, and perceptual acuity. Minor deviations in altitude, heading, or formation position could propagate into operational consequences if ignored, and the crew's attention, though fatigued, remained disciplined, scanning continuously, adjusting subtly, reacting instinctively yet deliberately. The tail section groans softly under pressure, a subtle echo of previous evasive maneuvers. While the guns remain idle, there present a latent reminder of action taken and danger survived. Frost-lined plexiglass diffuse light in shifting patterns, casting shadows over worn flight jackets, creased gloves, and instrument panels scarred by repeated use. The visual texture of the cabin, metal, glass, and fabric, mirrored the emotional landscape. Disciplined, tense, yet quietly exhausted, bearing the accumulated weight of both threat and procedure. The pilot adjusted altitude slightly, allowing minor relief in engine load, while the navigator recalculated for wind and drift, a slow, deliberate convergence of mechanical, environmental, and human factors that define the ongoing survival of the aircraft. In these post-engagement minutes, reflection layered over operational reality. The young pilot noted the subtle resilience of the aircraft, the precision of his crew, and the narrow margins by which minor choices had intersected with fate. Each minor dent, each tremor of metal, each frost-streaked panel carried a memory of exertion, skill, and risk. The bombardier, observing muted light glinting off residual smoke, absorbed the quiet gravity of the destruction below, a reminder that success in mission often carried an unspoken cost. The bomber's engines hummed in steady resonance as formation drifted back toward relative alignment. Minor mechanical adjustments maintained stability. Wings flexed under aerodynamic load, and instruments flickered with the residual oscillations of prior stress. The crew exhaled subtly, bodies relaxing just enough to balance comfort with readiness. Each movement a measured negotiation of endurance and operational necessity. Even as immediate danger receded, the imprint of exertion, vigilance, and accumulated stress remained, a quiet yet tangible presence in posture, expression, and awareness. By the time the aircraft leveled fully in steady air, minor damage had been logged, operational adjustments maintained stability, and the crew had absorbed both physical and emotional consequences. The flight engineer continued subtle monitoring of engine and systems, ensuring residual strain did not escalate. The pilot, eyes sweeping horizon and instruments, maintained a rhythm of attention that integrated learning from the sortie's intensity, balancing caution with mission continuity. The navigator's maps, faintly creased and damp with condensation, reflected the adjustments, drift, and corrections made in real time, a record of both precision and endurance. The bomber moved forward through muted clouds, engines humming, fuselage flexing, wings undulating subtly, carrying crew and cargo through sky defined not by the absence of threat, but by the careful management of fragility, skill, and collective effort. The emotional weight of survival lingered in micro-expressions. The slight tightness of a jaw, a measured breath, the calm scanning of instruments and horizon, the quiet, sustained vigilance, the layered awareness of mechanical, environmental, and tactical factors, and the subtle, embodied acknowledgement of consequence marked both the crew and the mission. Even in the diminishing threat, the reality of aerial war remained, fragile, precise, and unforgiving.